On a quiet evening in the city, a struggling street musician was just a few dollars short of rent when the sky suddenly opened and rain sent people scattering for cover. In the middle of the chaos, he spotted an elderly woman stumble and fall. He didn't think twice, he rushed to help. That single act of kindness sparked a bond that would change both their lives forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The October wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of an early winter through downtown Portland, Oregon. Street lamps flickered to life as evening approached, casting long shadows across the bustling intersection of Burnside and 3rd Avenue. This was where dreams and desperation collided daily, where the city's heart beat strongest and sometimes broke the loudest. Jerome Washington adjusted the strap of his worn guitar case and found his usual spot near the Max Light rail station. At 34, he carried himself with the careful posture of a man whose back had been broken and rebuilt, whose confidence had been shattered and slowly pieced back together with whatever materials he could find. His calloused fingers, once skilled at operating heavy machinery, now coaxed music from 6 strings and a body of wood that had seen better decades. The guitar, a 1987 Yamaha FG 180 that his father had bought from a pawnshop for $60, was both his voice and his lifeline. 3 years ago, a scaffolding collapse had crushed 2 vertebrae in his lower back, ending his career in construction and beginning a long, painful journey through workers' compensation disputes, mounting medical bills and the slow erosion of everything he'd built. Tonight, Jerome needed $47. Not 50, not 45, exactly 47. Rent was due in 3 days and he was short. His daughter Keisha's homecoming dress would have to wait another week, despite his promises. The voice in his head, the one that sounded suspiciously like his ex-wife during their worst fights, whispered the familiar refrain, "You can't even take care of yourself, Jerome. How are you going to take care of anyone else?" He began with "Stand By Me," his voice rich and warm despite the cool air. After 3 years of street performing, Jerome had learned to read crowds like weather patterns. Tonight felt different though. The usual urgency that drove his performances, the silent calculation of dollars per song, the careful monitoring of which commuters slowed their steps and which hurried past, felt muted by something else he couldn't name. Across the street, Eleanor Hartwell was having what she would later describe as the worst day of her 72 years. The distinguished widow clutched a manila envelope containing the final foreclosure notice on Hartwell Music, the store she and her late husband Edward had operated for 43 years. Her left hand trembled, not just from the Parkinson's that had been stealing pieces of her coordination for the past 2 years, but from the weight of 43 years of memories condensed into legal documents that made it all sound like a simple business transaction. Eleanor had spent the day boxing up the last remnants of their life's work. Sheet music that Edward had collected from estate sales, vintage instruments that young musicians could no longer afford, dreams that had sustained them both through decades of thin profit margins and deep community connections. The store hadn't just been a business, it had been their way of nurturing Portland's music scene, of giving talented kids their first instruments on payment plans that sometimes stretched for years and were frequently forgiven altogether. Now, walking to her car with shaking hands and the devastating finality of foreclosure, Eleanor felt every one of her 72 years. The tremor was worse when she was stressed, and tonight it conducted its own cruel symphony as she fumbled with her keys in the gathering dusk. She had parked across from the Max station, a choice she now regretted as she navigated through the evening crowd. Her balance wasn't what it used to be, and the emotional exhaustion of the day had left her feeling disconnected from the bustling world around her. That's when she heard it, a voice that seemed to cut through the urban cacophony with startling clarity. Jerome had moved into his second song, a slow bluesy version of Georgia on My Mind that transformed the busy street corner into something more intimate. Eleanor found herself stopping for the first time in months, really stopping, letting the music wash over her. The song reminded her of Edward, who used to hum Ray Charles melodies while tuning pianos in the shop's back room. For a moment, the foreclosure notice felt less heavy in her hands, the 43 years less like an ending and more like a story worth remembering. But Portland's October weather had other plans. What started as a light mist quickly intensified into a proper Pacific Northwest downpour. Commuters scattered like startled birds, seeking shelter under awnings and in doorways. Eleanor, caught in the middle of the street, felt her careful composure finally cracking under the combined weight of rain, grief, and the tremor that made every step uncertain. Her foot caught on an uneven piece of sidewalk, the kind of hazard she would have navigated easily 5 years ago, before the Parkinsons began stealing her confidence along with her coordination. The fall happened in slow motion, the manila envelope flying from her hands, its contents scattering across the wet pavement like autumn leaves, Eleanor hitting the ground hard, her left wrist taking the brunt of the impact. From his position under the Max station's partial overhang, Jerome saw the elderly woman fall. The practical part of his mind, the part that had been calculating how many more songs he needed to play to make his $47, immediately quieted. What he saw wasn't a stranger who might interrupt his busking, he saw someone in pain, someone who needed help. It was a distinction that defined Jerome Washington more than any tragedy or triumph in his personal story ever could. Without hesitation, Jerome set his guitar case aside, along with the $18 in crumpled bills he'd earned that evening, and stepped into the rain. His back protested immediately, the old injury always flared up in wet weather. But the pain was background noise compared to what he saw, a dignified woman sitting on wet concrete, looking dazed and vulnerable in a way that reminded him of his own mother in her final months. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Jerome's voice carried the same warmth that had drawn Eleanor to his music moments before. He knelt beside her, unmindful of the rain soaking through his jacket. "I'm Jerome, can you tell me your name?" Eleanor looked up into the face of this stranger, a black man probably young enough to be her son, with kind eyes and an expression of genuine concern that cut through the fog of her shock. She realized she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked about her well-being with such evident sincerity. "Eleanor," she managed, her voice shaking from more than just the cold. "Eleanor Hartwell, I think something's wrong with my wrist." Jerome had seen enough construction site injuries to recognize the signs. Her wrist was already beginning to swell, held at an angle that suggested fracture rather than sprain. Around them, the scattered papers from her envelope were becoming increasingly soggy, but Jerome's attention was entirely focused on the woman in front of him. "Mrs. Hartwell, we need to get you out of this rain and probably to an emergency room," Jerome said gently. He looked back at his guitar case, still sitting under the Max station overhang with his evening's earnings scattered in the open case, his rent money, his grocery money, his small buffer against the constant anxiety of not having enough. For a moment, the old voices competed in his head. "You can't afford this, you have responsibilities. Keisha needs that homecoming dress, the rent won't pay itself." But louder than all of that was his father's voice, steady and sure. "Son, there's always someone carrying a heavier load than you. When you can help lighten it, you do." "Mrs. Hartwell," Jerome said, his decision made before his practical mind could sabotage it. "I'm going to help you to your car, and then I'm going to drive you to the hospital. We can figure out everything else after we make sure you're okay." The emergency room at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital buzzed with the familiar controlled chaos of a Friday night. Jerome sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, Eleanor's purse in his lap while she underwent x-rays down the hall. He hadn't counted the soggy bills he'd left behind in his guitar case, but he estimated it was probably close to $20. Combined with what he had in his wallet, he might make rent if he played all weekend and the weather held. The practical voice in his head reminded him that he'd chosen to be here, that every minute in this hospital was a minute not earning money. But every time he started to calculate the cost of his decision, he remembered Eleanor sitting on that wet sidewalk, looking lost and fragile in a way that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. "Mr. Washington," a nurse appeared at his elbow. "Mrs. Hartwell is asking for you." Jerome found Eleanor in a curtained-off area, her left arm now sporting a bright blue cast from her knuckles to just below her elbow. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the hospital gown and harsh fluorescent lighting, but her eyes were clearer than they'd been on the street. "Clean break," Eleanor reported, managing a wan smile. 6 weeks in this fashionable accessory, though at my age good as new is a relative term." Jerome settled into the visitor's chair beside her bed, noting the way she held her casted arm protectively against her body. "That's good news about it being clean. Complicated fractures are much harder to heal from." There was something in the way he said it, a familiarity with medical terminology that suggested personal experience rather than casual knowledge. "You sound like someone who's been through this before," Eleanor observed. Jerome's smile carried the weight of 18 months spent in and out of hospitals, physical therapy sessions, and workers' compensation hearings. Construction accident 3 years back. Fell off a scaffold, compressed 2 vertebrae. Spent more time in places like this than I care to remember. Eleanor studied his face, noting the careful way he sat, the slight tension around his eyes when he moved. Is that why how did you end up playing music on street corners? It was a delicate question, the kind that acknowledged the gap between where someone probably started and where they'd ended up. Jerome appreciated that she'd asked it gently, without the judgment he sometimes heard in similar inquiries. Used to work construction with my father, Jerome said, his fingers unconsciously drumming against his thigh in the rhythm of a song only he could hear. Good money, steady work. After the accident, workers' comp fought the claim for 8 months while I burned through my savings on medical bills, lost my apartment, had to move in with my sister for a while. He paused, remembering those months of feeling like he was imposing on everyone around him, of watching his marriage fall apart under the stress of financial insecurity and his own struggles with chronic pain and depression. Music was the one thing that still felt like mine, Jerome continued. My father taught me to play when I was 10, said it was important to have something that belonged just to you. When everything else fell apart, I still had the guitar. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, not the painful tightness that had been her constant companion since the foreclosure notice arrived, but something looser, more open. Here was a man who had lost everything that defined his sense of himself as a provider and protector, and instead of becoming bitter, he had chosen to create beauty for strangers on street corners. Jerome, Eleanor said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know it's okay to say no. Jerome felt that familiar flutter of anxiety, the one that came whenever someone needed something he wasn't sure he could provide. What is it, Mrs. Hartwell? Those papers that scattered when I fell, they were foreclosure notices. I'm losing my husband's music store. The words came out steady, but Jerome could hear the effort it took to keep them that way. I can't drive with this cast, and there are things I need to retrieve from the store before they change the locks next week. She looked at him directly, her blue eyes holding a mixture of embarrassment and desperate hope. I have no right to ask this of you, especially when you've already done so much, but I don't have anyone else to call. Jerome's first instinct wasn't generous, it was practical, calculating. He had exactly $31 in his wallet and no idea how he was going to make rent if he spent the weekend helping Eleanor instead of playing music. He had a daughter who needed him to be reliable, not running around playing Good Samaritan to strangers who couldn't pay him for his time. But looking at Eleanor, this dignified woman who was trying so hard to hold herself together while her world collapsed around her, Jerome heard his father's voice again. When you can help lighten someone's load, you do. The rest usually works itself out, Mrs. Hartwell. Jerome said, the words coming out before his practical mind could stop them. I'll help you, whatever you need. Eleanor stared at him for a long moment. Jerome, I can't pay you. I barely have enough left to cover the hospital copay. Did I ask for payment? The question hung between them, highlighting the assumptions that economic desperation had taught them both to make. Eleanor realized she had been projecting her own financial anxieties onto this man who had already sacrificed his evening's income to help a stranger. No, she said quietly. No, you didn't. It was past 11 o'clock when they finally left the hospital. Jerome drove Eleanor to her small house in the Selwood neighborhood, a 1920s craftsman that showed signs of careful maintenance, stretching a tight budget, paint that had been touch-up rather than fully refreshed, gutters that had been cleaned but needed replacement, a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of too many Oregon winters. The interior of the house told the story of a long marriage and modest circumstances, photographs spanning decades, bookcases filled with music theory texts and biographies of composers, a baby grand piano that dominated the small living room like a beautiful piece of furniture that happened to make music. Edward played, Eleanor explained, following Jerome's gaze to the piano. He was classically trained, but he could play anything. Jazz, blues, country, it didn't matter to him. Music was just music. Jerome approached the piano and ran his fingers lightly across the keys, not pressing hard enough to make sound but feeling the familiar resistance of well-maintained instruments. He taught you, he tried. Eleanor settled carefully onto the couch, cradling her cast against her chest. I was better at the business side of things, keeping track of inventory, managing the books, dealing with suppliers. We made a good team for 43 years. And now? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring at the piano as if it held answers to questions she wasn't sure she was ready to ask. When she spoke, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying too much alone for too long. Now I'm a 72-year-old woman with Parkinson's disease, a broken wrist, and a foreclosure notice. Edward's been gone for 8 months, and I've been trying to keep the store running, but the numbers don't lie. We were barely breaking even when he was alive, and I don't have his skills with customers or his ear for what instruments are worth. She looked at Jerome, her expression a mixture of resignation and something that might have been the faintest trace of hope. I think it's time to admit that some chapters end whether we're ready or not. Jerome heard something in her voice that he recognized, the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle you know you're losing, from trying to honor the memory of someone you love while acknowledging that you're not equipped to carry on their work alone. Mrs. Hartwell, Jerome said carefully, what if this isn't an ending? What if it's just a very difficult transition? Eleanor's laugh held no humor. Jerome, you don't understand. The store is gone, this house will probably be next when I can't make the mortgage payments. I have nowhere to go and no skills that anyone wants to pay for. Maybe not the same skills in the same way, Jerome conceded. But you have 43 years of knowledge about music, about instruments, about working with musicians. You have relationships with teachers and students and suppliers. That's not nothing. It's not enough to pay bills, no, probably not by itself, but it's something to build from. Eleanor studied Jerome's face, searching for signs of the kind of empty optimism that well-meaning people sometimes offered when they didn't understand the reality of a situation. Instead, she saw something steadier, not blind hope, but the kind of hard-earned wisdom that comes from losing everything and discovering that survival was possible. Jerome Washington, Eleanor said, 3 hours ago you were playing music on a street corner to pay your rent. What makes you think you're qualified to give advice about building a life from nothing? Jerome's smile was rueful but genuine. Because 3 years ago, I fell off a building and lost everything I thought defined me as a man. Spent 18 months feeling sorry for myself and blaming everyone else for my problems. You know what I learned? What? Feeling sorry for yourself is a luxury most of us can't afford for very long. Eventually you have to decide whether you're going to let your circumstances define you, or whether you're going to define yourself in spite of your circumstances. And which did you choose? Jerome gestured toward the window, in the general direction of the street corner where they'd met. I chose to make music, even if it's just on a street corner, even if it barely pays the bills. I chose to put something beautiful into the world instead of just complaining about what was taken away from me. Eleanor was quiet for several minutes, processing not just Jerome's words but the example of his actions throughout the evening. Here was a man who had every reason to focus solely on his own survival, who was struggling financially in ways that made her own problems seem manageable by comparison. And he had given up his evening's income, money he obviously needed to help a stranger. Jerome, she said finally, would you play Edward's piano, just for a few minutes? Jerome looked uncertain. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm not trained, I mostly just play by ear, folk songs and blues. Your husband was classically trained. Edward always said that the best music came from the heart, not from sheet music. He'd want the piano to be played, not preserved like a museum piece. Jerome settled onto the piano bench, his hands finding their way across the keys with the tentative confidence of someone who understood music intuitively rather than academically. What emerged wasn't a specific song so much as a conversation between memory and hope, a gentle exploration of melody that seemed to acknowledge the sadness of loss while insisting on the possibility of something beautiful emerging from the ruins. As Jerome played, Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, not the painful tightness that had been her constant companion since Edward's death, but something looser, more expansive. This stranger, this man who had sacrificed his own needs to help her, was offering her something precious, the reminder that human kindness still existed, that people could choose to care for each other without expectation of reward. When the music faded into silence, Eleanor found herself crying, not the bitter tears of loss and frustration that had marked the past 8 months, but something cleaner, more hopeful. Thank you, she said simply. Jerome stood from the piano bench, suddenly aware of how late it had become, and how much he had disrupted his carefully planned evening. But looking at Eleanor, this woman who was facing the loss of everything she and her husband had built together, he felt no regret about the choices he had made. Mrs. Hartwell, what time should I pick you up tomorrow to go to the store? Jerome, you don't have to. What time? He repeated gently. Eleanor realized that arguing would be futile. This man had already demonstrated that his word meant something, that when he made a commitment, he honored it regardless of the cost to himself. 10 o'clock. I'll be here at 10. As Jerome prepared to leave, Eleanor caught his arm with her uninjured hand. Jerome, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Do you have family? Someone who worries when you don't come home on time? Jerome's expression shifted, carrying a mixture of love and regret. I have a daughter, Keisha. She's 16, lives with her mother across town, smart as hell, wants to study engineering in college. He paused, considering whether to share more. I was supposed to give her money tonight for a homecoming dress. Guess that'll have to wait until next week. Eleanor felt her heart constrict. This man had given up money intended for his own child, money he obviously couldn't spare to help a stranger. The magnitude of his selflessness hit her like a physical blow. Jerome, she started, but he was already shaking his head. Don't, Mrs. Hartwell. Keisha's a good kid. She'll understand that some things are more important than a dress. After Jerome left, Eleanor sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the memories of her life with Edward and the echo of music played by someone who had never learned to read notes but understood everything about creating beauty from pain. For the first time since Edward's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. Outside, the rain had stopped, and Portland's lights sparkled like scattered diamonds against the darkness. Somewhere across town, Jerome was probably explaining to his daughter why her homecoming dress would have to wait another week. Somewhere else, the guitar he'd abandoned on a street corner was probably soaking wet, the $18 he'd earned scattered by the wind. But in this moment, in this small house filled with music and memory, Eleanor understood that she had witnessed something remarkable, a man who had lost everything choosing to give even more, not because he could afford to, but because he understood that some things mattered more than affording. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather that seemed to match Eleanor's mood as she prepared for what felt like a funeral for her life's work. Jerome appeared at her door exactly at 10 o'clock, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a clean shirt that Eleanor suspected might be his only one. Figured you might need caffeine for this, he said, handing her one of the cups. Eleanor accepted it gratefully, noting that he'd somehow remembered she took it black from their brief conversation at the hospital. It was a small detail, but it suggested the kind of attentiveness that had been absent from her life since Edward's death. The drive to Hartwell Music took them through the Pearl District, past converted warehouses that now housed expensive condominiums and artisanal coffee shops that served $12 sandwiches to tech workers who had no idea that this area had once been home to artists, musicians, and working-class families. Edward and I used to walk these streets every Sunday morning, Eleanor said as Jerome navigated the light traffic. Back then, you could hear music coming from windows and doorways. It was like the whole neighborhood was alive with sound. What happened to all those musicians? Jerome asked, pushed out by rent increases mostly. The same people who made the Pearl District interesting were the first ones priced out when it became fashionable. Jerome nodded, understanding the economics of displacement from his own experience. After his accident, he'd had to move 3 times as landlords discovered they could charge more for his 1-bedroom apartment than he could afford on disability payments. They parked in front of Hartwell Music, and Eleanor sat in the passenger seat for a moment, looking at the store as if she were seeing it for the last time. The building was a 3-story brick structure from the 1920s, with large windows that had been carefully arranged to showcase instruments in natural light. But what struck Jerome immediately was the sense of care that permeated everything. This wasn't a store designed to maximize profit per square foot, but a space created to serve musicians. 43 years, Eleanor said quietly. Edward proposed to me right here in front of this window. Said he wanted to marry someone who understood that music was more important than money. Jerome could see the weight of memory in her posture, the way she held herself as if she were carrying something fragile and irreplaceable. What do you want to take first? Eleanor unlocked the front door, and they stepped into the hushed atmosphere of the store. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny musical notes. Jerome found himself speaking more quietly, as if he were in a library or a church. The store was larger than it had appeared from the street, with a back room that housed repair equipment and storage, and a small office upstairs where Eleanor and Edward had managed the business side of their operation. Eleanor moved through the space with the careful precision of someone navigating a familiar landscape that would soon be changed forever. Most of the instruments need to go to Morrison's Music for consignment, she explained, running her good hand along the neck of a vintage Gibson guitar. What I really need to pack are the personal things, photographs, Edward's repair tools, the music collection we built over the years. As they worked, Eleanor began sharing stories. The saxophone that a teenage student had rented for school band, whose parents had struggled for 6 months to make payments before Edward quietly marked their account paid in full. The piano that had been purchased by parents whose daughter had cerebral palsy, music being the one area where her disability became irrelevant. The guitar that Edward had sold to a Vietnam veteran for $5 because the man's hands shook from PTSD, and music was the only thing that calmed them. Edward never thought of this as just a business, Eleanor said as she carefully wrapped a set of antique tuning forks. He thought of it as a kind of ministry. He believed everyone had music inside them, and his job was to help them find the right instrument to let it out. Jerome understood what she meant. His own relationship with music had begun not with lessons or theory, but with the discovery that his hands could create something beautiful from the strings of his father's old guitar. Music hadn't been entertainment in his household, it had been necessity, a way of processing emotions that had no other adequate expression. What about you? Jerome asked as they worked. Did you ever play? Eleanor's laugh carried both amusement and regret. Edward tried to teach me piano for years. I could read music, I understood theory, but I never developed feel for it. My contribution was keeping the books balanced so Edward could focus on the music. That matters too. Artists need someone who understands the practical side, I suppose. Eleanor paused in her packing, looking around at the instruments that had defined her adult life. But sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to connect with music the way Edward did, the way you do. Jerome looked up from the box he was filling with sheet music. What makes you think I connect with music? Last night, when you played Edward's piano, you weren't just hitting keys, you were having a conversation with the instrument. That's not something you can teach. Their work was interrupted by a knock at the store's front door. Through the glass, Jerome could see a middle-aged black woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing teenagers and bureaucracy in equal measure. That's Denise Foster, Eleanor said, moving to unlock the door. She teaches at Jefferson High School. She's been trying to start a music program there for years, but the district keeps cutting arts funding. Denise entered the store with the purposeful stride of someone whose day was measured in overcrowded classrooms and underfunded programs. She embraced Eleanor carefully around her cast, her expression mixing genuine affection with professional concern. Eleanor, I came as soon as I heard about the foreclosure. This is devastating. Half the musicians in Portland got their start in this store. The numbers don't lie, Denise. We've been running in the red for 2 years and I don't have Edward's touch with customers. Denise looked around the store with the expression of someone witnessing the demolition of a landmark. There has to be something we can do. A fundraiser maybe, or it's too late for that, Eleanor said gently. But I called you because I know you've been trying to get instruments for your students. Take whatever you can use for the school. Better that than having everything scattered to dealers who don't understand what these instruments meant to the people who played them. Jerome watched this exchange with growing understanding. Eleanor wasn't just losing a business, she was dismantling a community resource that had connected musicians across generations and economic circumstances. The ripple effects would extend far beyond her personal financial situation. Actually, Denise said, I wanted to talk to you about something else. Jefferson finally got a small grant to start an after-school music program, but I need someone who understands instruments, someone who knows how to match students with the right equipment and maintain it. Eleanor shook her head, her expression mixing interest with resignation. Denise, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm 72 years old with Parkinson's and a broken wrist. I don't think I'm the right person to start over with teenagers. You don't think what? That 43 years of experience could help kids who've never had access to music education? That you know more about making music accessible than anyone else in this city? Jerome found himself watching Eleanor's face as Denise spoke, seeing something flicker behind her eyes. Not hope exactly, but the faint recognition of possibility where before there had been only endings. It wouldn't be the same as this, Eleanor said, gesturing around the store. No, it wouldn't be the same. It would be different. Maybe better in some ways, working directly with kids instead of selling to people who already have access to music. Eleanor looked at Jerome, as if seeking his opinion about something that could affect them both. He realized that in less than 24 hours she had begun to trust his judgment about things that extended far beyond the practical details of medical care and transportation. "What do you think?" she asked him. Jerome considered the question carefully, thinking about his daughter Keisha, who attended a school where music education had been eliminated due to budget constraints. He thought about the kids he saw hanging around bus stops and convenience stores, looking for something to fill the hours between school dismissal and their parents' return from work. "I think," Jerome said slowly, "that Edward would probably say you're not finished yet." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, and Jerome could see her weighing his words against her own fears and limitations. Finally she turned to Denise. "I can't promise how much energy I'll have or how long I could do it. I'm not asking for guarantees. I'm asking for whatever you can give, for as long as you're able to give it, and I'd need help. Someone who understands music and working with teenagers." Denise looked at Jerome with sudden interest. "You play, don't you? I could hear it in the way you talked about connecting with instruments." Jerome felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the same feeling he got when people suggested he was qualified for things that required credentials he didn't possess. "I'm not trained formally, I just play by ear, mostly on street corners." "Can you teach a kid to hold a guitar properly? Can you show someone how to find their first chord?" Yes, I suppose I could do that." "Then you're qualified enough to start." Eleanor was looking back and forth between Jerome and Denise with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Are you two conspiring to give me a reason to get up in the morning?" "We're conspiring to give a bunch of kids something they've never had access to," Denise corrected. "If that happens to give you a reason to get up in the morning, that's what my grandmother would have called a blessed side effect." As they continued packing throughout the afternoon, Jerome found himself thinking about the conversation in ways that surprised him. He had spent the morning focused on helping Eleanor salvage what she could from the wreckage of her business. Now he was beginning to see that what looked like an ending might actually be a transformation. "Jerome," Eleanor said as they loaded the last box of personal items into her car, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Okay, if we did this, if I worked with Denise to help start this program at Jefferson High, would you consider helping? I know you have your own financial obligations, and I don't know what the school could pay, but..." Jerome thought about his conversation with Keisha the previous week, about college applications and the growing stack of bills on his kitchen table. He thought about the uncertainty of street performing, the physical toll of standing for hours in all weather, the constant anxiety of never knowing if he'd earn enough each day to cover his basic expenses. Then he thought about the possibility of using his music to help other people's children, of being part of something that created opportunities rather than just helping him survive from day to day. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jerome said, "I think Edward might not be the only one who isn't finished yet." That evening, after they had returned to Eleanor's house and shared a simple dinner of soup and sandwiches, Jerome sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a notepad, trying to figure out if he could afford to commit to something that might not pay enough to cover his bills. Eleanor watched him work, noting the careful way he wrote down numbers, the slight frown of concentration as he calculated rent and utilities and child support payments. "Jerome," she said quietly, "Edward had a life insurance policy. It wasn't much, but it's enough to pay someone part-time to help me organize donated instruments and work with students." Jerome looked up from his calculations. "Mrs. Hartwell, you don't have to. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering employment doing something that matters, something that Edward would have wanted to support." Jerome studied her face, searching for signs of pity or condescension. Instead he saw something he was learning to recognize, the expression of someone who understood that helping others was often the most effective way of helping yourself heal. What would the work involve? Coordinating instrument donations, basic repairs, helping match students with appropriate instruments for their size and interests. Maybe some basic instruction for kids who've never held an instrument before. Jerome thought about the morning's conversation with Denise, about the possibility of being part of something that gave teenagers opportunities he'd never had at their age. "How much?" $400 a week to start. "If the program grows we could probably manage more." Jerome did the math quickly. It was less than he'd made in construction, but more reliable than busking, and it would give him a reason to get up each morning that extended beyond his own immediate survival needs. Mrs. Hartwell, Jerome said, I think we might be able to help each other. Eleanor smiled, the expression carrying the contentment of someone who had found a way through grief to something resembling purpose. Jerome, I think Edward would have liked you very much. As Jerome prepared to leave that evening, Eleanor walked him to the door with the careful steps of someone whose balance couldn't be taken for granted. Jerome, she said, I want you to know that what happened yesterday, meeting you on that street corner, that wasn't an accident. What do you mean? I mean that some encounters happen exactly when they're supposed to, bringing exactly what people need even when they don't know they need it. Jerome thought about the previous evening, when he had been focused on earning $47 to make rent, about the choice he had made to help a stranger instead of protecting his own immediate interests. The decision had seemed risky at the time, possibly even irresponsible given his obligations to Keisha and his precarious financial situation. Mrs. Hartwell, Jerome said, I think you might be right about that. 3 weeks later, Jerome stood in Jefferson High School's converted storage room that served as their makeshift music space, surrounded by donated instruments that looked like refugees from better times. Eleanor sat at a card table that functioned as her desk, her cast now decorated with signatures and doodles from 17 different teenagers who had claimed her as some combination of teacher, grandmother, and patron saint of second chances. The after-school music program had launched the previous Monday with 12 students and high hopes. By Wednesday, half of them had stopped showing up. By Friday, Jerome was questioning whether enthusiasm was enough to overcome the gap between wanting to help kids and actually knowing how to reach them. Mr. Jerome called Destiny Williams, a 14-year-old freshman with attitude that could cut glass and a musical ear that surprised everyone, including herself. This piano sounds like it's dying. Jerome walked over to examine the ancient upright that dominated one corner of the room. Destiny was right, several keys produced no sound at all, others stuck halfway down, and the tuning was so far off that even simple melodies sounded like musical arguments. You're not wrong, Jerome admitted, pressing a key that responded with a sound somewhere between a musical note and a mechanical wheeze. But sometimes the best music comes from working with what you've got instead of waiting for perfect conditions. Destiny looked skeptical. My grandmother says that's just what poor people tell themselves to feel better about being poor. The comment hit Jerome harder than he expected, partly because it echoed his own doubts about whether they were setting these kids up for success or just teaching them to settle for less than they deserved. Your grandmother might have a point, Jerome said honestly, but she might also be missing something important. Like what? Like the difference between settling for less and learning to find beauty in imperfect situations. That sounds like the same thing with different words. Jerome sat down on the piano bench beside Destiny, his fingers finding the keys that actually worked. Play something, anything. Just use the keys that make sound. Destiny rolled her eyes but began picking out a simple melody. Mary Had a Little Lamb, using only the functional keys. It was halting and incomplete, but recognizable. Now Jerome said, play it again, but this time I'm going to add some bass notes with these lower keys that work. As Destiny repeated her melody, Jerome added a simple accompaniment that transformed the children's song into something more complex, more interesting. Other students drifted over to listen, drawn by the unexpected richness of sound coming from an instrument they'd dismissed as broken. You see? Jerome said as the music faded. The piano isn't perfect, but it can still make music. The question isn't whether we have the best equipment, it's whether we're willing to work with what's available to create something beautiful. Eleanor looked up from where she was cataloging donated sheet music, her eyes bright with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching someone discover they're better at teaching than they thought they were. But Jerome's moment of pedagogical success was interrupted by the arrival of David Chen, Jefferson High's principal, who appeared in the doorway, wearing the expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. Miss Foster, Principal Chen called to Denise, who was helping a student adjust the strap on a guitar that was probably older than his parents. Could I speak with you for a moment? Jerome watched as Denise walked over to the principal, her posture immediately tensing in the way that suggested she was preparing for news that would complicate her already difficult job. Their conversation was too quiet for him to hear, but he could read enough in their body language to know that something was wrong. When Denise returned to the group, her face was carefully neutral in the way that teachers learn when they need to deliver disappointing news while maintaining morale. "Everyone, can I have your attention?" Denise called out, waiting for the students to put down their instruments. "I need to tell you about something that might affect our program." The students listened with the particular stillness that teenagers reserve for announcements that might disrupt something they've begun to value. Jerome found himself holding his breath, realizing how much he had come to care about this experiment in creating opportunity where none had existed before. The school district is reviewing all after-school programs as part of their budget planning for next year, Denise continued. Programs that don't have established track records are being evaluated more closely. "What does that mean exactly?" asked Marcus Thompson, a sophomore whose knowledge of music production impressed Jerome daily. "It means we need to demonstrate that this program is making a measurable difference in students' academic performance and school engagement. We have until December 15th to present our case to the school board." Eleanor raised her uninjured hand. "What kind of presentation are they looking for?" "Data showing improved grades, better attendance, increased graduation rates, the kind of metrics that school boards understand." Jerome felt his stomach drop. They'd been operating the program for 3 weeks. Half their original students had already stopped attending, and the ones who remained were still learning to hold instruments properly. The idea of proving measurable academic impact in 6 weeks seemed impossible. "That's not fair," Destiny said, voicing what several other students were clearly thinking. "We just started. How are we supposed to prove anything in that amount of time?" Denise looked around at the circle of faces, teenagers who had found something they didn't want to lose, adults who had discovered a sense of purpose they hadn't expected to find. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we're going to figure it out together." After the students left that afternoon, Jerome, Eleanor and Denise remained in the converted storage room, surrounded by the instruments and equipment that represented their shared bet on the power of music to change lives. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked Jerome, who had been unusually quiet during cleanup. Jerome picked up the guitar he'd been working with, a beat-up acoustic with a crack running along its back, but a surprisingly warm tone. "I'm thinking about something my daughter told me once about the difference between proving something works and proving it's worth keeping." "What's the difference?" Denise asked. Jerome looked around the room, mentally cataloging the small changes he'd observed in the students over the past 3 weeks. Marcus had begun writing original songs. Destiny had discovered she could play melodies by ear. A quiet girl named Aisha had found her voice singing backup vocals for other students' performances. Proving something works means showing measurable results according to someone else's criteria, Jerome said slowly. Proving it's worth keeping means showing what would be lost if it disappeared. Eleanor's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that Jerome was learning meant she was about to turn a good idea into something ambitious. "You're talking about a concert, not just any concert," Jerome said, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "A concert that shows these kids performing for their families and community, demonstrating what they've learned but also what they've discovered about themselves." Denise looked skeptical. "Jerome, these kids have been playing for 3 weeks. They're not ready for public performance." "Maybe they're not ready to perform perfectly," Jerome said, "but they might be ready to perform honestly. And sometimes that matters more." "The school board wants data," Denise pointed out. "They want test scores and attendance records." "Then we'll give them both," Eleanor said, with the kind of quiet determination that Jerome had learned to respect. "We'll show them the numbers, but we'll also show them the music. Let them decide which tells the more complete story." Over the next 2 weeks, the music program transformed into something that resembled a small-scale campaign. Eleanor coordinated with her network of former customers to arrange for better instruments to be loaned for the concert. Jerome worked with the students on pieces that showcased their individual growth while acknowledging their limitations. Denise managed the logistics of organizing a community event, while simultaneously documenting every piece of data that might support their case to the school board. But the real transformation was happening in the students themselves. The impending deadline had given their efforts a sense of urgency and purpose that changed the energy in the room. This wasn't practice for a grade or participation credit, this was preparation for something that could determine whether their newfound musical community would continue to exist. "Mr. Jerome," Marcus said during one afternoon session, "what if people don't like what we play?" Jerome paused in his tuning, recognizing the question as one that went to the heart of every performer's deepest fear. "Marcus, do you like the music you're making?" "Yeah, I do, but that's different from other people liking it." "Is it? When you're playing or singing, are you trying to please everyone in the room, or are you trying to share something that's important to you?" Marcus considered this. "I guess I'm trying to share something that matters to me." "Then that's your job as a performer. Some people will connect with what you're sharing, some won't. But as long as you're being honest about what the music means to you, you're doing what you're supposed to do." Eleanor looked up from where she was helping Destiny work through a piano arrangement. "Jerome's right, Marcus. The goal isn't perfection, it's authenticity. People can hear the difference." As the concert date approached, Jerome found himself thinking more about the larger implications of what they were attempting. The music program had become more than an after-school activity for him. It had become a test of his own beliefs about whether individual actions could create meaningful change, about whether investing in other people's potential was a sustainable way to build a life. 2 nights before the concert, Jerome sat in his small apartment, practicing the songs he would play to support the students' performances. His guitar case was open on the floor beside him, but instead of containing the crumpled dollar bills that had once represented his daily survival, it now held sheet music that Eleanor had helped him transcribe, simple lead sheets that would allow him to provide accompaniment for teenage voices that were still finding their confidence. His phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. "Dad, can't wait to hear you and your students perform tomorrow night. Mom says she's proud of what you're doing." Jerome stared at the message for several minutes, feeling a complex mixture of gratitude and anxiety. The relationship with his ex-wife had been complicated by years of financial stress and his struggles with depression after the accident. But somehow the music program had begun to change how she saw him, not just as someone who had failed to provide stability, but as someone who was building something meaningful with his life. The night of the concert, the Jefferson High School auditorium buzzed with an energy that surprised everyone involved. What they had expected to be a small gathering of parents and school officials had grown into something larger. Word had spread through Portland's music community, and the audience included former Hartwell Music customers, local musicians and community members who had heard about the program through social media and local news coverage. Jerome stood backstage with his students, all of them wearing the kind of nervous energy that comes before important performances. They had practiced for hours, but he could see the uncertainty in their faces as they heard the size of the audience gathering in the auditorium. "Mr. Jerome," Destiny said, her usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable, "what if we mess up?" "Then you mess up in front of people who are here because they care about you," Jerome replied. "And you keep playing anyway, because that's what musicians do." The concert opened with Destiny at the repaired piano, playing a simple arrangement of Amazing Grace that showcased both her natural ear and the limitations they'd been working within. Her confidence grew with each measure as she realized the audience was with her, not judging her. Marcus followed with an original song about growing up in North Portland, a piece that combined his love of hip-hop with traditional chord progressions Eleanor had taught him. The audience listened with the focused attention that indicated they were hearing something authentic and powerful. But the evening's most moving moment came when Aisha, who had barely spoken during the program's first week, stepped forward to sing a solo version of "Lean on Me." Her voice, clear and strong despite her nervousness, seemed to transform the auditorium into something more intimate, more connected. As Jerome watched from the wings, providing guitar accompaniment for each performance, he realized that something unexpected was happening. What had begun as a program designed to save itself from budget cuts had evolved into something larger, a demonstration of what was possible when adults chose to invest in young people's potential, when community members decided to support each other's growth. When the final notes of the evening's last song faded into sustained applause, Jerome felt a profound sense of completion, not the end of something, but the successful beginning of something that could continue growing long after this particular evening was over. Later, after the audience had dispersed and the instruments had been packed away, Jerome found himself alone with Eleanor and Denise in the now quiet auditorium. The school board members seemed impressed, Denise reported. They stayed for the entire concert, took lots of notes, asked to meet with us next week. "And the program?" Eleanor asked. "Not just funded for the rest of the year, but they want to expand it."
They're talking about finding money to hire Jerome part-time and possibly starting similar programs at 2 other schools. Jerome felt the news settle over him like a warm coat on a cold day. The prospect of steady employment doing something he cared about, working with people who shared his commitment to creating opportunities for young people, seemed almost too good to be true. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a note of excitement that Jerome had learned to associate with her best ideas. "I've been talking with some of the musicians who came tonight. There's interest in starting a city-wide instrument lending program, using my network from the store to connect donated instruments with kids who can't afford to buy them." "Eleanor, that sounds like it could be a full-time job," Denise observed. "Maybe it is. Maybe that's exactly what I need, a reason to use 43 years of experience to create something new instead of just mourning what's been lost." Jerome looked around the auditorium where an hour earlier his students had shared their music with a community that had chosen to listen and support them. The evening had demonstrated something he'd been afraid to believe, that individual choices to help other people could create chains of positive change that extended far beyond their original scope. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jerome said, "I think Edward would be amazed by what you're building." Eleanor smiled, her expression reflecting the contentment of someone who had found her way through grief to something resembling hope and purpose. "Jerome, I think my husband would say we're not building anything new, we're just finding a different way to continue the work he started." As they prepared to leave the auditorium, Jerome realized that the evening had marked more than the success of a single concert or the rescue of an after-school program. It had demonstrated the possibility that kindness wasn't just a personal virtue but a strategy for creating the kind of community where everyone's potential could be recognized and nurtured. But as Jerome walked to his car that night, his phone buzzed with a call from his ex-wife, Lisa. "Jerome." Lisa's voice carried an urgency that immediately put him on alert. "I'm sorry to call so late, but it's about Maya." Jerome's stomach dropped. "What's wrong? Is she hurt?" "No, nothing like that, but she's been asking about you a lot lately, about what you're doing with the music program. She wants to talk to you about something important, but she's nervous about bringing it up." Jerome sat in his car in the school parking lot, feeling the weight of parental responsibility settling over him. Despite the evening's success, despite the growth of the program and the possibility of steady employment, his relationship with Maya remained the most important and fragile part of his life. "What does she want to talk about?" "College applications. She's been researching music therapy programs, says she wants to do something like what you're doing but with kids who have disabilities or trauma. But she's worried about the cost, worried about asking you for help when she knows you've been struggling." Jerome felt his chest tighten. Maya had inherited his musical ear and his father's instrument-making hands, but she'd also inherited the family tendency to worry about being a burden to the people she loved. "Lisa, can you put her on the phone? She's asleep, but I wanted you to know that what you're doing, this work with the kids, the way you've turned things around, it's having an impact on her that goes beyond just being proud of her father. She's seeing possibilities for her own life that she wouldn't have considered before." After the call ended, Jerome sat in the parking lot for a long time, thinking about the complicated mathematics of parenthood. The money he'd given up that first night to help Eleanor, money that was supposed to go toward Maya's homecoming dress, had set in motion a chain of events that might now make it possible for him to help fund her college education in ways he'd never imagined. But more than that, his choice to prioritize helping others had shown Maya something about the kind of person she wanted to become, the kind of work that gave life meaning beyond just financial security. Ease in the now quiet auditorium. The school board members seemed impressed, Denise reported. "They stayed for the entire concert, took lots of notes, asked to meet with us next week." "And the program?" Eleanor asked. "Not just funded for the rest of the year, but they want to expand it. They're talking about finding money to hire Jerome part-time and possibly starting similar programs at 2 other schools." Jerome felt the news settle over him like a warm coat on a cold day. The prospect of steady employment doing something he cared about, working with people who shared his commitment to creating opportunities for young people, seemed almost too good to be true. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a note of excitement that Jerome had learned to associate with her best ideas. "I've been talking with some of the musicians who came tonight.
There's interest in starting a citywide instrument lending program, using my network from the store to connect donated instruments with kids who can't afford to buy them. Eleanor, that sounds like it could be a full-time job, Denise observed. Maybe it is. Maybe that's exactly what I need, a reason to use 43 years of experience to create something new instead of just mourning what's been lost. Jerome looked around the auditorium where an hour earlier his students had shared their music with a community that had chosen to listen and support them. The evening had demonstrated something he'd been afraid to believe, that individual choices to help other people could create chains of positive change that extended far beyond their original scope. Mrs. Hartwell, Jerome said, I think Edward would be amazed by what you're building. Eleanor smiled, her expression reflecting the contentment of someone who had found her way through grief to something resembling hope and purpose. Jerome, I think my husband would say we're not building anything new, we're just finding a different way to continue the work he started. As they prepared to leave the auditorium, Jerome realized that the evening had marked more than the success of a single concert or the rescue of an after-school program. It had demonstrated the possibility that kindness wasn't just a personal virtue but a strategy for creating the kind of community where everyone's potential could be recognized and nurtured. 6 months later, on a warm April morning that felt like Portland's apology for its long gray winter, Jerome stood in what had once been Hartwell Music, watching volunteers transform the space into the headquarters for Second Chance Instruments, Eleanor's nonprofit organization. The building's owner, moved by the story of the concert and Eleanor's work with students, had donated the space rent-free for the first year. The store's original character remained, the large windows still showcased instruments, though now they displayed donated guitars, keyboards and horns waiting to be matched with young musicians across the city. But the space had been reconfigured to serve its new purpose: repair stations where volunteers restored damaged instruments, a small recording studio where students could document their progress, and Eleanor's office upstairs, where she managed a network that now connected 12 schools with instrument donations and music instruction. Jerome's own transformation had been equally dramatic. He was now the district's part-time coordinator for community music programs, a position that had required him to complete his GED and take education courses at Portland Community College. The work paid enough to cover his bills while leaving time for him to continue performing, not on street corners for survival, but at community events and school concerts where his music served a purpose beyond his own economic needs. Mr. Jerome, called Destiny, now a confident sophomore who served as one of the program's student mentors, the elementary school kids are here for their orientation. Jerome watched as a group of 3rd and 4th graders filed into the space, their eyes wide with excitement and uncertainty. These were students from schools where arts programming had been eliminated years ago, and for many of them, this would be their first hands-on experience with musical instruments. The orientation program was designed to be both educational and inspirational. Older students demonstrated various instruments while younger children rotated through stations, trying everything from guitar to piano to drums. Jerome had learned that some of his most meaningful teaching moments came during these sessions, when established students had to explain what they'd learned to newcomers, and discovered how much they actually knew. During the session, Jerome's attention was drawn to a small boy, maybe 8 years old, who was watching the demonstrations with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was seeing possibilities he'd never imagined for himself. The boy's clothes were clean but well worn, and he had the careful posture of a child who had learned to be still and observant in new situations. "What's your name?" Jerome asked during the break, kneeling beside the boy. "Michael Rodriguez," the boy said quietly. "Are these real? I mean, can kids really learn to play them?" Jerome felt that familiar recognition of a moment that could matter in ways that might not become clear for years. "They're real, and yes, kids can definitely learn to play them. Would you like to try something?" Michael nodded eagerly, and Jerome led him to one of the smaller guitars that Second Chance Instruments kept specifically for young beginners. He showed Michael how to hold the instrument, how to position his small fingers to form a simple chord, how to strum with gentle confidence rather than nervous energy. The sound that emerged was imperfect but unmistakably musical, and Michael's face lit up with pure joy. Around them, other students and volunteers gathered to listen, creating an impromptu circle of encouragement. "How does it feel?" Jerome asked. "Like the music was already inside me," Michael said, his voice filled with wonder, "and the guitar just helped me let it out." Jerome looked around at the faces surrounding them, Teenagers who had discovered their own musical voices over the past months, younger children who were seeing new possibilities for their futures, adults who had chosen to invest their time in creating opportunities for the next generation. Eleanor appeared at his elbow, moving more slowly than she had 6 months ago, but with an energy that seemed to come from having found meaningful work to do with her remaining years. "I just got off the phone with the school district office," she said quietly. "They want to expand the program to 5 more schools next year. They're also asking if you'd be interested in a full-time position coordinating music education for the entire district." Jerome felt a complex mixture of excitement and anxiety. The offer represented financial security he hadn't experienced since before his accident, but it also meant taking on responsibilities he wasn't sure he was qualified to handle. "What would that involve?" he asked. "Curriculum development, teacher training, program evaluation, essentially building a systematic approach to what we've been doing here through improvisation and good intentions." Jerome thought about Michael, still strumming the guitar with careful concentration, and about all the other 8-year-olds across the city who might never discover their musical voices without programs like this one. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jerome said, "when I met you that night, I was focused on surviving one day at a time. I never imagined being part of something this big." Eleanor smiled, her expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who had learned that endings could become beginnings if approached with sufficient creativity and courage. "Jerome," she said, "I don't think any of us imagined this, but that's the thing about choosing to help people, you never know where it's going to lead." As the orientation session continued, Jerome found himself reflecting on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A rainy evening, a stranger who needed help, a series of choices that had seemed risky at the time, but had created opportunities none of them could have anticipated. The students were now performing an informal concert for the visiting elementary school children, nothing elaborate, just simple songs that showcased what young people could accomplish with donated instruments, volunteer instruction, and the kind of community support that Second Chance Instruments had helped create. Watching Marcus accompany Destiny's singing while Aisha provided harmony, Jerome realized that they weren't just making music, they were demonstrating the possibility of collaboration across differences, of young people supporting each other's growth, of beauty emerging from circumstances that weren't perfect but were infused with caring and commitment. After the elementary students left, Jerome remained in the space with Eleanor and a small group of volunteers, cleaning up and preparing for the evening's advanced instruction sessions. The rhythm had become familiar and comfortable, the daily work of maintaining an organization that created opportunities for young people to discover their potential. "Jerome," Eleanor said as they worked, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to help me that night?" The question caught him off guard, not just because it touched on something he wondered about himself, but because it suggested Eleanor understood how much that single decision had changed both their lives. "I think about it sometimes," Jerome admitted. "But I also think that focusing too much on alternative histories can keep you from appreciating what actually happened. But what if you hadn't been there? What if you'd chosen differently?" Jerome considered the question seriously, looking around at the space filled with instruments and the evidence of systematic effort to create musical opportunities for children who wouldn't otherwise have access to them. "I think someone else would have helped you," Jerome said finally. "Maybe not that night, maybe not in the same way, but I believe that when people need help, other people step forward. The question isn't whether good things happen, it's whether we choose to be the people who make them happen when we have the opportunity." Eleanor nodded, her expression suggesting she'd been thinking along similar lines. "Edward used to say that the best way to honor the help you've received is to find ways to help others." I think he would have been amazed by what's grown out of that rainy evening. That night, after the advanced students had completed their lessons and the volunteers had gone home, Jerome found himself alone in the space that had once been Hartwell Music, surrounded by instruments that would soon find their way to young musicians across the city. His phone buzzed with a text from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Jerome, this is Michael Rodriguez's mom. Thank you for letting him try guitar today. He hasn't stopped talking about it. Can you tell me how we could arrange lessons for him?" Jerome smiled, already composing his reply, already thinking about the network of relationships that Eleanor had built, the donated instruments that were waiting for children ready to discover their musical voices, the chain of kindness and opportunity that continued to grow and extend in directions none of them could have predicted.
One year after that rainy October night, Jerome stood on the stage of Portland's historic Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall, looking out at an audience of 800 people gathered for Second Chance Instruments' first annual benefit concert. The evening would feature performances by students from 7 different schools, alongside professional musicians who had volunteered their time to support the organization's work. But before any of that began, Jerome had been asked to share the story of how Second Chance Instruments started, a story that had become somewhat legendary in Portland's music community, though Jerome suspected the retelling had made both him and Eleanor sound more heroic and less desperate than they'd actually been that night. A year ago, Jerome began, his voice carrying clearly through the concert hall's excellent acoustics. I was standing on a street corner with a guitar and $47 between me and homelessness. I thought music was something I did to survive, a skill that could earn me enough money to make it through another day. He paused, looking out at faces that included school board members and city officials alongside parents, students and community members who had supported the program's growth. That night, I met Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who was dealing with her own crisis, the loss of her husband's music store, after 43 years of serving this community. What we both discovered was that sometimes the things that look like endings are actually beginnings, if you're willing to see them that way. Jerome gestured toward Eleanor, who was sitting in the front row wearing an elegant black dress and the kind of smile that suggested profound satisfaction with work well done. Her Parkinson's had progressed over the past year, but she remained actively involved in the organization's daily operations, her network of relationships and decades of experience proving invaluable as the program expanded. Tonight you're going to hear from 67 young musicians who have discovered their voices through Second Chance Instruments. Some of them started with broken pianos and donated guitars, some had never held an instrument before joining our programs. All of them represent the possibility that emerges when communities choose to invest in young people's potential. The concert itself was a testament to how much the program had grown and evolved. The opening performance featured Michael Rodriguez, now 9 years old and confidently playing a guitar piece he'd composed himself, a simple but heartfelt melody about finding music in unexpected places. His mother sat in the third row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son perform on a stage where professional musicians regularly appeared. Destiny, now a junior at Jefferson High, and the program's lead student coordinator, performed an original song about the intersection of music and social justice, her piano playing accompanied by a small ensemble of younger students she'd been mentoring. Her confidence and musical sophistication demonstrated what could happen when teenagers were given opportunities to develop their talents over sustained periods. Marcus, who had received a full scholarship to Portland State University's music program, returned to perform a piece that blended hip-hop production with classical composition, a sound that had emerged from his work with Eleanor, who had introduced him to music theory, and Jerome, who had encouraged him to trust his own creative instincts. But the evening's most moving moment came when all 67 students took the stage together for a performance of Lean on Me, the same song that Aisha had sung solo at that first nervous concert in Jefferson High's auditorium. Their voices, representing ages from 8 to 18 and coming from schools across Portland, created something larger than music. They created a demonstration of community, of young people supporting each other across differences of age and background and experience. As Jerome provided guitar accompaniment for this final song, he found himself thinking about the individual stories that had brought each of these young people to this stage. There were kids who had discovered in music a way to process trauma and loss, others who had found in the program their first experience of adult mentorship and consistent encouragement, students who had used musical collaboration to build friendships across racial and economic lines that usually divided Portland's schools. When the last notes faded into thunderous applause, Jerome felt the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing that your life's work aligns with your deepest values. But more than that, he felt awed by the evidence of how far individual acts of kindness could travel when they found the right conditions to grow. During the reception that followed the concert, Jerome found himself in conversation with David Chen, the principal who had initially threatened to cut the program for budget reasons. "You know," Principal Chen said, "when I first heard about your music program, I was skeptical, another well-intentioned after-school activity that would consume resources without producing measurable results." "What changed your mind?" Jerome asked. the data. Initially, students in your program showed improved attendance, better grades, fewer disciplinary problems. But tonight, Chen gestured toward the reception area, where students' parents and community members were mingling in animated conversation. Tonight I'm seeing something the data couldn't capture. I'm seeing community engagement, intergenerational mentorship, young people who understand they have something valuable to contribute to the world. Jerome nodded, understanding what Chen meant. The quantifiable benefits of the program were important for securing funding and institutional support. But the real value lay in the relationships that had formed, the sense of purpose that students had discovered, the way music had become a medium through which young people could envision and work toward better futures. Later in the evening, Jerome found Eleanor in a quiet corner of the reception area, resting her feet and watching the celebration with evident satisfaction. "Tired?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Gratefully exhausted," Eleanor replied. Edward would have loved this, seeing all these young people discovering what music could mean in their lives. Jerome looked around at the reception, noting how naturally the students interacted with adult supporters, how comfortably they moved between conversations with their peers and presentations of their work to potential donors and community partners. "Mrs. Hartwell," Jerome said, "can I tell you something I've never shared with anyone else? Of course, that night we met when I decided to help you instead of finishing my set, I was terrified I was making the wrong choice. I had bills due, promises to keep to Keisha. Every practical consideration told me I couldn't afford to get involved with a stranger's problems." Eleanor turned to look at him directly, her eyes sharp despite the tremor in her hands. "What made you do it anyway?" Jerome considered the question, thinking about all the ways his life had changed since that rainy October evening. "I think I was tired of living like survival was the only thing that mattered. I wanted to find out if there was still room in my life for the kind of person I used to think I was, someone who chose helping over hoarding, community over competition. And what did you discover? That helping other people is the most practical thing you can do. Not because it guarantees anything, but because it creates the conditions under which good things become possible." Eleanor smiled, the expression carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to see loss as preparation for different kinds of gain. "Jerome, I think that rainy night taught us both that the best investments are the ones you make in other people's potential. The returns are unpredictable, but they tend to be larger and last longer than anything you could achieve by focusing solely on your own immediate needs." As the reception wound down and families began gathering their children and instruments for the trip home, Jerome found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with Keisha the previous week. She was now a high school senior, planning to study music therapy in college, inspired by seeing how music could create connections between people who might otherwise remain isolated from each other. "Dad," she'd said, "I used to worry that you were too generous, that you cared more about helping other people than taking care of yourself and me. But watching what you've built with Mrs. Eleanor and all these students, I realize you were taking care of us in a way I didn't understand at the time." "What do you mean?" Jerome had asked. "I mean you were showing me that the best way to build a secure life isn't to protect yourself from other people's problems, but to create the kind of community where everyone's problems become shared challenges that can be solved together." Now, watching the students pack up their instruments and say goodbye to teachers and volunteers, Jerome understood what Keisha had meant. The security he'd found through Second Chance Instruments wasn't the individual security of a steady paycheck and reliable benefits, though those things mattered. It was the deeper security that comes from being embedded in a network of relationships based on mutual support and shared commitment to each other's growth. A year ago, Jerome had been one missed payment away from eviction, one injury away from disaster, one bad day away from complete despair. Tonight, he was surrounded by dozens of people, students, parents, fellow teachers, community volunteers, who had become invested in his success because he had chosen to become invested in theirs. As he helped load instruments into cars and said goodnight to students who had become as important to him as his own daughter, Jerome realized that the greatest gift of helping Eleanor hadn't been the career change or the sense of purpose, or even the financial stability that had eventually followed. The greatest gift had been the reminder that kindness wasn't a luxury for people whose own needs were already met, but a strategy for creating the conditions under which everyone's needs could be addressed. It was an investment in the kind of future where mutual aid replaced individual struggle, where community support made personal security possible for everyone rather than just those fortunate enough to be born into circumstances that provided it automatically. Walking to his car under Portland's clear spring sky, Jerome thought about Michael Rodriguez, who would probably spend the weekend practicing the guitar piece he'd performed that evening. About Destiny, who was already planning next year's student leadership program. About Marcus, whose scholarship would allow him to develop his musical talents at a level that had seemed impossible when they'd first met in that converted storage room at Jefferson High. Each of these stories represented the continuation of something that had begun with a stranger needing help and someone choosing to provide it. The ripple effects continued to spread in directions none of them could have anticipated, touching lives in ways the original participants might never fully understand. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text message from a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Jerome, this is Maria Santos. My daughter Sophia just started at Woodstock Elementary, and she came home today saying she wants to learn violin because Mr. Jerome's kids performed at her school. Can you tell me how to get her connected with your program?" Jerome smiled, already composing his reply, already thinking about the violin in Eleanor's collection that would be perfect for a beginning student, already imagining another 8-year-old discovering that music could be something she participated in rather than just something she listened to. The story that had begun on a rainy October night was still being written, still growing, still reaching toward possibilities that none of them could have imagined when a man with a guitar decided that helping a stranger was more important than protecting his own immediate interests. Some gifts, Jerome had learned, keep giving long after the original moment of generosity has passed. The best ones create ripples that spread far beyond what anyone could have planned or predicted, touching lives in ways that the original giver might never even know about. But they all begin the same way, with someone choosing to care about a stranger's well-being, with someone deciding that other people's needs matter as much as their own immediate concerns, with someone recognizing that we are all connected by invisible threads of mutual dependence and shared humanity. Standing in the parking lot of Portland's most prestigious concert hall, surrounded by the sounds of families celebrating their children's achievements and planning for futures that seemed bright with possibility, Jerome felt profound gratitude for the rainy night that had changed everything. It had taught him that the most important question anyone can ask isn't "What do I need?" but "How can I help?" And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, those two questions turn out to have the same answer.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.